touch this. Can't touch this. Can't touch this. Can't touch this. Bring it down.
Hello and welcome to Hammerheads, the Hammer Horror-based podcast with me, Miles Watts, and another person whose name is Marcus Wilson. Hello, Marcus.
Good evening. How are we?
We're very well this evening, and this is episode 13 of our journey through 17 of the best Hammer horror movies as recommended by the BFI. They did a fantastic list a couple of years ago of the best movies from each, one good movie from each year of Hammer's main output from 57 to 74, which is the year Marcus and I were born.
And you know which year this film was released in? It was in fact the year I got my first real six-string. It was the summer of '69.
Did you buy it at the Five and Dime?
I did.
That's where I got mine, yeah. I must have seen you in there if we were both in the Five and Dime buying six-string, you know.
Me with my bleeding fingers.
Bleeding Fingers Murphy. No, that's someone else. So this is 1969. So this is the last film we'll be covering for now from the 60s. We're not saying we won't come back to other Hammer films, because a couple of people
60s, yes.
And we've wondered, you know, when we're done with these 17 movies, will we go back and do some other Hammer horror films? Will we do other films? Will we continue at all? Who knows or dares to dream. So this evening's study in horror is Frankenstein must be destroyed.
And he really must, because he's a menace in this film.
He really is a shit. Yeah, this is so starring Peter Cushing as Frankenstein, and it's great because this one, we'll say a bit more about the production to start with, but this one, he has actually lost the plot, Frankenstein, at this point.
Yes,
he's not well.
He's gone very much to the dark side. We're 5 movies into the Frankenstein franchise with Hammer at this point. So yes, interesting territory. And I suppose we're at the end of the 60s as well, when the censors were obviously taking some time off because.
Yeah. Well, last time we looked at The Devil Rides Out, which was the Dennis Wheatley adaptation, and that starts to have a few things in it where you're like, oh, we are in the late 60s now for sure, because some little influences start creeping in. And this one, for example, has themes in it like serums and injections and that kind of thing that's a little bit more horror tropey than Hammer used to go for. They used to have these mythical creatures, and now it's like ghoulish experiments using needles and scalpels and This is definitely the less glamorous side of brain extraction and implantation. Yeah, the glamorous side being something like The Man with Two Brains with Steve Martin, where he just like screws off the top of your skull and pops the brain out. You know, that's the sort of lush swish style of brain transplant, but this is a kidnapping bodies and pulling the brain out type scenario.
It's right from the first scene. I mean, yes. You see this. What is it? It's like a hat box or something. That is being carried in old. Well, it's not London town, is it? It's sort of an unnamed European city.
It did look very European, actually. There were sort of shades of maybe even like German expressionism in this one, which they don't tend to do in Hammer films. But the sets in this one were marvelous. Yeah, very gothic, and there was some fantastic gothic architecture, particularly later on in this sort of dungeon room where he keeps Anna. And I loved the design of it. And then occasionally, especially in Frankenstein's house, you can see that it's the old Hammer set. I mean, it was filmed at Elstree by now.
Yes.
But they've got that big staircase with the balcony, which is the classic Hammer layout, almost like a theatrical set. But there were some differences in this. I actually thought this one looked phenomenal. I think it looks one of the nicest looking. By now, they knew what they were doing in terms of set design and cinematography, and I think it looks absolutely lush. It really doesn't look cheap at all.
Yeah, and maybe it's the Elstree thing, and then cinematography by Arthur Grant. But it does look particularly amazing.
Yeah, and Arthur Grant's done obviously a few films before this that he did Quatermass, which is one of our faves, definitely, and he did the last couple. He did Devil Rise Out, I think. Could be wrong there, but he's done the last few Hammer films that we've reviewed. But yeah, I thought that was flawless, absolutely flawless. The set design and cinematography this time, like it was absolutely one of the best looking Hammer films I've seen. It was lovely.
So Frankenstein has miraculously escaped from his fate in the previous film, as he does at the end of every Frankenstein film. And he's back and he's experimenting. And he's going by the name of Dr. Fenner, which is why I thought the film might be called Frankenstein Must Be Defenestrated.
Very good. 5 points for that one.
But the film is written, obviously... Anthony Nelson Keys is producing as usual, but he usually likes to write these things as well. But he had so much on his plate. Apparently, he got in a newcomer by the name of Burt Batt, who
Burt Batt.
Yeah, who'd never been heard of before, and by the look of it, never was heard from again. But
he sounds like a Muppets character, doesn't he? Burt Batt.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Burt Batt. He sounds like one of Count Dracula's, the Count's minions.
Yes, he does.
Burt Batt goes out and does all the Count's bidding, you know. Yeah, but it was quite nicely written. In fact, I liked. For a start, you got Peter Cushing in it, who's always just amazing to watch. He had some great lines in it. I love the fact that my favorite in the whole film was when you first kind of meet Frankenstein and he's pouring himself a drink and he's eavesdropping all of those old
that's a great
pompous
scene.
men. And they're going, well, the thing what happened is this. And he goes, he said, I didn't know any of you were doctors. And they go,
We're not doctors.
We're not doctors. He goes, it's just that you seem to think you know everything what you're talking about. And, he said, sorry, idiocy always piques my interest. And I was just like, ooh, burn. He does this great series of burns and then leaves the room. I was like, you go, Pete. Yeah.
He's cold.
Yes.
Pete, he's cold in this film, I'm telling you.
He is, isn't he? He's got no real humanity to him. And I mean, he does some horrific things, which we'll get into, not least removing someone's brain and putting it in another man. He does some awful stuff.
Well, it's become very matter of fact by now, because the first films, you know, that was a big part of it, and now it's almost like there's this doctor, Dr. Brandt, who has been working on similar sorts of experiments to Dr. Frankenstein. And Victor Frankenstein, sorry, Baron Frankenstein.
He's Baron, isn't he?
He is, yes. And so that Dr. Brand has something in his head, like some knowledge that Victor Frankenstein wants, but Brandt's gone mad. He's in the lunatic asylum, and Frankenstein just seems to consider him almost like sort of there's this like USB stick, like in his there's something in his brain that he has to get out and stick in another computer so he can get access to this secret recipe, and it's all very kind of calculating, and rather than Frankenstein's monster be this kind of grotesque thing, in this film we really just get Victor Frankenstein using these poor people for his own ends, and you know, sticking one brain into another without much thought, and they're not kind of grotesque. They're just very kind of sad and scary individuals, just because they, you know, it is scary to think of your brain in somebody else's body, and you kind of see this Dr. Brandt wake up and look down at himself and realize that he's no longer in his own body. And it's terrifying.
That's the horror of this film, isn't it? I think, and obviously they make a great sort of like feature of it in the last act. I think the whole thing with, and you know, it took me about an hour to realize that was Freddie Jones.
Yes.
I was like, hang on a minute, is that Freddie Jones? And I've got a story about Freddie Jones that involves me, and I'll mention that soon. But I nearly worked with Freddie Jones, kind of. So yeah, the final act is him realizing that he's wants to get revenge on Frankenstein and go and basically just wants revenge because he's like, I'm stuck in the body of this other man. My wife She don't want to sleep with me no more.
It's a very sad scene, isn't it? Because he goes to see his wife in this new body, and he has to talk to her from behind this screen because she's so utterly terrified of him.
Yeah, and he's like, just listen, my voice isn't going to sound like my voice, but he tries to prove that it's him. And it's sad. It's a bit like sort of RoboCop or something, when he sort of dreams of going back to see his wife, and his wife wouldn't recognize him and thinks he's dead and all that. It sort of reminded me of that. But yeah, it was sad. It was sad. And you do feel sorry for Brandt.
You do. And it sort of goes back to the source of Mary Shelley's book and some of the original Universal Frankensteins, that the monster is seeking revenge.
Yes, exactly. And he's a sympathetic character. I mean, the monster in the original, he's created to be monstrous. But you also, if you create something like that with feelings and emotions and rage, and then you put it in the body of a hulking great beast, it's going to cause problems, whereas it causes problems specifically in this case for Frankenstein, and he deserves what he gets at the end. But actually, I mean, we're skipping ahead to the end of the movie here already, but I love the scene where Brandt's just throwing gas lamps, oil lamps around to break. It's brilliant. He traps Frankenstein in his own house, throwing these oil lamps around to stop him getting, and he's just going, there is only one doorway left. I thought that was really well done.
Yes.
Yeah, and you just thought, you've brought this upon yourself. And he goes, you better go get those papers. And he's dashing around trying to get all this information, and he's just toying with it at the end. Frankenstein, is sure he's Frank. I mean, the film Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. It, as people always say, Frankenstein is the creator. And in this film, it is Frankenstein that needs to be destroyed. It's Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing must be destroyed. We must stop this absolute lunatic from doing this stuff with people's brains.
Arguably, he is the monster.
He is the monster, yeah, which is interesting. And I thought overall the film, like it starts out, I thought this, in a lot of ways, is a classic Hammer film because it feels like the structure feels right. But then it becomes more interesting.
So simple, isn't it? I mean, it's like I think there's probably one side plot, which is, the police are trying to find him, and they sort of realize that Frankenstein is at large again, but that offers a bit of comic relief, and there's this Thorley Walters as Inspector Frisch.
I think actually, and I read that they sort of put that in a bit late in the day, the comic relief with the inspectors. They were sort of trying to appease Americans, because apparently Americans like comedy inspectors. But and it made the film about 10 minutes longer, because this film is 100 minutes, and most Hammer films are 90 minutes. I noticed this one was 100 minutes. I was like, oh, that's the longest one we've watched so far, 100 minutes, which doesn't seem very long these days. But
it's weird, that side plot just doesn't go anywhere. It just peters out. And otherwise the film is just one thing happens, then another thing happens, and it is all very linear and so simply told. Yeah. Such a straightforward storytelling.
Yeah, it is, and in that way it is. But in a lot of ways, you like, okay, you can't just use the same formula forever. I'm just finding a fact, by the way. It's on my phone. You can't just use the same formula forever. And I was like, okay, it's another film where there's a mad doctor, and I was like, oh, but then by halfway through, I was like, oh, they're doing something different with it again. So it keeps you guessing. It was the producer, Sir James Carreras. Okay, so Sir James Carreras is the guy who's like real. He's a real reason for Hammer becoming commercially successful, because he just knew he had this catchphrase: every poster makes a movie. And he was like, he believed you could sell these films based on their posters. Look, we're making this one next, give us some money, which is something you do when you're getting into films, like you're trying to convince people, give us some money based on these ideas, and apparently he wanted it was to please him that it had all this extra stuff in, like with the inspectors and stuff, and also the horrific rape scene that Frankenstein does with Anna. Well,
the story seems to be that the American distributors who were getting more and more involved with Hammer at this point were kind of insistent that, by the sound of it, that there were some comedy detectives, but also that there was a horrendous rape scene. So I don't know what that says about American audiences, that they want both of those
that's it. I mean, did they ask for it, or did they assume it's like, you know what, you need bumbling inspectors and rape. That's what we need. And if you have a bumbling inspector that commits rape, even better. I'm like, no, like it's horrible, because Anna, the poor girl that he does rape, is then in complete sort of shock for the rest of the movie. I mean, he basically he breaks her and then treats her like a servant. I want some coffee. It's like, Victor Frankenstein, you absolute monster. I mean, are you meant to like hate him even more by that point? And also seeing Peter Cushing ravishing a young lady, I'm like, that's just wrong.
Well,
you know?
I mean, both Peter Cushing and Veronica Carson, who plays Anna, and the director Terence Fisher, hated the idea that they were going to have to do this rape scene. Apparently, James Carreras walked in one lunchtime. It wasn't in the script, and said, "No, you must do this." Our like American backers have said that this must be in we have to do something to appease them and make it a bit more edgy. Or I don't know what it was, but So I think that Peter Cushing apparently took Veronica Carson out to dinner before, and like
I can imagine,
apologetic, and said,
I can imagine he was very charming, and I always love that story. I think we've told it here before about Carrie Fisher when she had to act with Peter Cushing in Star Wars, and he had to be horrible to her, and she had to be horrible to him, and she said, "I can't be horrible to Peter Cushing." He smells like lavender, and he's the sweetest man. And apparently, he did all his scenes as Governor Tarkin that were waist up with his slippers on, because he said, "I just want to be comfortable." And she had to say, "I recognised your foul stench when I was brought on board." She said, "I feel so bad saying this to Peter Cushing, who's like the sweetest man alive." So yeah, it's funny. You can imagine a bunch of American like movie moguls with cigars going, "More rape." It's like, I mean, that wouldn't wash these days. You would hope, No, we're not putting a rape scene in it.
And then there isn't any kind of relief at the end. Anna is bumped off at the last scenes.
She has a horrible time of it from about halfway on. I mean, she's going through it anyway, and then she gets ravished by Frankenstein, and it was quite shocking.
And
I was quite shocked.
So it's like even much is made of the fact that she's stabbed to death by Frankenstein.
No. That's it. There's lots of sort of like rogue stabbings and shootings. Like Simon Ward gets shot at the end just before, by when Frankenstein is dragged back in by the monster.
No one's
but not before Simon Ward gets shot. I was like, James Herriot's been shot. So it was good. I think I'll be honest and say it's not my favorite Hammer film. I think it was good, and it was a good watch, and it had a lot of things going for it, as we've just discussed. But I think by this stage, and we're about to get into the era where they were going really out there for some ideas, it was like, okay, we'll do Frankenstein again, but we'll do this with it. And I think the most interesting thing about it, looks great. It's amazingly made. Peter Cushing's brilliant as always, but the best thing about it, I think, was Freddie Jones, who you really feel sorry for. He just goes around in a terrible bald cap with a scar around his skull, but it's like you don't think, oh, he's lost it. You're just like, oh, he's out for revenge, and he fully deserves it. So good for you, Freddie. And so my Freddie Jones story was, I was about 10 years ago. Working with a filmmaker and we didn't end up making the film, but I wrote this script, and he asked me to write a feature script, and it was a horror film. And I'm not going to say anything about it because it didn't get made, and it might get made by someone else one day. But I wrote a first draft script for a horror film, which was going to have Freddie Jones in it. Mm-hmm. So there was the role of, he was an old man, an old villager who knows what's going on, basically. He knows that there's something afoot in this little village, and I wrote it with Freddie Jones in mind. So I watched a couple of his movies, like Elephant Man and stuff, and I was like, right, if I'm going to write for Freddie Jones, I'm going to watch a couple of his movies just to familiarize myself. So I've written a script somewhere. I have a script that I wrote for Freddie Jones, but the film didn't happen.
I had no idea that his son was Toby Jones either.
Toby Jones, yeah. So Freddie Jones only died in 2019, age 91, I think.
Okay.
He hung in there. And Toby Jones, I think, is about 57, 58. I think he was born in, because I was looking up his stats earlier as well, just to see the amount of films Toby Jones has been in. I just watched the Post Office drama that he was in which he was absolutely, I mean, he's always great, Toby Jones. He's very versatile. Like his dad, he's very good at playing heroes and villains. He's played equally shocking villains as he has lovable heroes. So he's obviously got the acting gene, Toby Jones, that his dad had, because his dad was this stalwart of stage and screen and TV for decades and decades.
And this
I think
was
I first,
quite early in his career as well, his film career.
yeah, he hadn't been in much by then, had he? But I remember him mostly as Bites in The Elephant Man, where he's absolutely beastly and he tortures John Merrick, and he's like the guy who tries to show him off and then ends up sort of playing a part in his downfall, you know. But he's just wretched. He's this wretched man called Bites who works in the circus. So yeah, Toby Jones, Freddie Jones's son. They don't look that alike either, I don't think.
No. I mean, no one really looks like Toby Jones, does it?
That's true. He must look like his mum. I haven't seen a picture of his mum. I don't know what she looks like, but I think it's actually Freddie Jones reminds me a little bit of a young Donald Sutherland in this movie.
Yes.
He's got a similar vibe, but he was very, very good in it.
Yes, he was. I mean, and he brings the kind of warmth and pathos, which, you know, there's this very cold Peter Cushing in and there's this whole whole section where we've got Carl and Anna, this couple who also run a boarding house, but Carl is a doctor as well, and basically Frankenstein is blackmailing Carl because he's seen that Carl is sort of selling some cocaine on the side to make a bit more money. And so Carl and Anna...
As we all do, you know.
That's right, yeah. Who doesn't?
This cocaine's really Moorish.
And Carl and Anna are sort of blackmailed by Frankenstein and spend the entire movie under his spell, which I think kind of works for me for most of it. You know, Frankenstein moves into their guest house and persuades them to kick everyone else out of the guest house. Yeah. And Carl becomes his assistant. But what I didn't really get, I mean, obviously Frankenstein's got some dirt on them, but when they get sort of in really deep and Frankenstein's asking them to basically kill people and decapitate them, and I don't understand quite why they don't just murder Frankenstein.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because he's the only one who knows.
Yeah,
maybe they're too really wholesome.
That didn't really kind of work for me.
I mean, maybe that Frankenstein rapes Anna as a sort of put the nail in the coffin.
I thought that would be the turning point. Well, or maybe getting him to murder people would be the turning point. I don't know.
Maybe these days he would attempt to rape her, and then she would get revenge on him, but and then you wouldn't get the monster having revenge. And it's certainly odd. It reminded me of The Curse of Frankenstein, which I think is the first one we watched, isn't it? Yeah. In the 1957 one, because you have Cushing, and then you have the monster that he's created that turns on him and stuff. And this is like a retelling of that, really.
Yes,
to some extent.
It's a whole load darker, and
it's more human, isn't it? It's more like, sure, brain swapping is not very, but you know, they did it even in Get Out. They do brain swapping, but it was less. There's a big monster on the loose, and it was more. Here's a mad doctor doing hideous experiments. Therefore, someone has been wronged. They're going to get their own back, rather than. So it's actually less. Like, if you consider some of the ones we've watched, like the last one we watched, Devil Rides Out, which is all about witchcraft and devilry. Yes. This is none of that. This is he's physically removed a guy's brain and put it in another man's body, you know, which is a problem for the man whose brain is, you know. So it's sort of, again, that's what I mean. It's like a Hammer film, but it's sort of not like a Hammer film. They've decided to just do something a bit more literal with it, maybe.
You get this great scene where Frankenstein is performing this brain surgery, basically, with Dr. Carl. And he's got his kind of handheld drill, just kind of hold this steady for me.
It did remind me of Man with Two Brains. There's a scene where Steve Martin he's a brain surgeon, but it's obviously a comedy. So he actually screws off the tops of people's heads. So you have just out of frame, you have him going and just popping the brains out. And I thought, wow, this would be really useful time for a screw top head, wouldn't it, Victor Frankenstein? But you've got a drill in it, and he's got Simon Ward dutifully helping him pull the brain out and stuff. And like, dude, you're in over your head. I mean, no pun intended. So there's a lot of enjoyable stuff about it. It was a bit hokey, but I think it's more than made up for by the final act. It's a good final act, and the quality of the performances and the way it looks and I love the score. The score reminded me of Jerry Goldsmith's score for Alien.
Yes. Okay.
Or obviously Alien reminded me of, I'm doing it the right way.
Yes.
Which weirdly, I heard on an episode of Grange Hill I watched this morning, right?
Oh.
So we're talking series 14 of Grange Hill, which is the early 90s. We're watching it on BritBox. And there's a scene where they do this weird experimental play on stage, and suddenly Jerry Goldsmith's score for Alien came in. It was so random.
That is random.
So I had that in my head when I was watching this film.
I didn't know that Grange Hill had any kind of score going on.
Yeah, it goes really mad in the early 90s. It's like the director decided that he was a frustrated filmmaker, and so he decided to. So it's like Mr. Griffith's coming to school, and it's got this music that sounds like a Nightmare on Elm Street. It's do, 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 like abandoned school and weird Dutch angles. And I'm like, this series was clearly made by someone who likes movies, because suddenly it went a bit Sam Raimi.
Oh, gosh.
Very strange. Yeah.
Well, did you know that Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed was dubbed into Welsh in 1978?
Yes, I read that. Are you going to have a go at pronouncing the Welsh version?
I'm not going to, no. I thought you could do that.
No, I can't speak Welsh, even though I have a Welsh girlfriend who can pronounce Welsh. I can't. I have trouble with it. And I'll get it wrong and offend loads of Welsh people.
It's a very weird kind of choice for translating into Welsh. Basically a video nasty from 1969.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's funny because I would say, like, of all the Hammer films, despite having pointed out all its flaws, this is one of the most complete productions. It looks and sounds terrific. The script is decent, the acting's very good, but the cinematography and the sets are just phenomenal. I think it's absolutely flawless visually.
It does look amazing, yes.
But it's not the best one. I think there are some that are a bit more hokey and a bit more over the top that are better and more memorable than this one.
I think that Hammer are still chasing that X rating, which they had been throughout their Hammer horror period. But I suppose that the censor was so lenient by 1969 that the X rated it kind of maybe takes it a bridge too far almost, that they're kind of trying to play to that. Because obviously they used to really play up that X-rated thing, because there was the Quatermass experiment, and they just have the letter X at the start as well, because it was kind of how they marketed the films. But
the Quatermass is so out there, and it's so different, and it's so surprising and memorable. You just sticks in your head, even though there's hokey bits and stuff. It's like, and some of the effects are terrible, and the alien effects and the blood but you think, well, that film's creepy. Whereas this one, they obviously knew what they were doing by this point, because they're able to make very professional looking films,
I did really enjoy it. I mean, I thought that the pacing of the film was quite slow compared to some of the others. But actually, it's been really interesting to watch the evolution of the Frankenstein films alongside the Dracula series in Hammer. Because actually, I think you can probably do more with the Frankenstein films, because Frankenstein, the character, I think, can probably kind of come on more of a journey, and he has kind of reached a very maniac kind of dark place in this one, but probably more than you can do actually with a Dracula character.
Yeah, which brings us nicely on to next week, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, it does. Yes.
Because what's next week, Marcus? Or next episode, we should say, because it won't be next week.
No, never.
Because we do one of these every couple of months.
We're going to taste the blood of Dracula.
The blood of Dracula, which is Christopher Lee's return as Dracula.
Yes.
Ralph Bates is in it as well. And
didn't Ralph Bates play? Did he play? Who did he play in one?
Yes, well, there's a sort of. I think they were trying to.
Frankenstein.
They were prepping Ralph Bates to take over if Christopher Lee charged too much. He was going to take over as Dracula, I think.
Really?